Stay right there. What are you waiting for? Kill him! Kill them both! No, wait a minute. Is it money you're after? I'll give you as much as you want.
May the saints forgive you, because I won't.
Okay, so I'm joined by Max Thrax, an amazing alt-lit dude from Twitter who, well, he's not from Twitter, but obviously we met on Twitter, and I'm really excited that he agreed to come on. And he suggested a OVA manga series that I was only peripherally familiar with, but when I dove in, I was like, this is fucking sick. So let's Max, I'll let you introduce yourself in the ways that you want to and that you will, and then let people know like where they can find you and your work and that, yeah, all of that.
All right. Well, thanks, Jen, for having me on Threshold Saints. I've been looking forward to coming on here. I listened to the episodes that you did with Tom Will and Dustin Cole, both authors for Farthest Heaven, who are kind of, I mean, I wouldn't say it's a sister publication to the one that I work for, Apocalypse Confidential, but both Tom and the guy who runs it, I mean, his name on Twitter is Bill. His real name is Will Ballard. He edited our first couple of books that we put out. So, you know, we're very fond of each other. I've always been a big fan of Farthest Heaven, and those were, you know, two great episodes on the show. So I'm Max Thrax. I'm a novelist and poet and managing editor of Apocalypse Confidential. Been doing that for a few years now. So Apocalypse Confidential is, I would call it a magazine, a publisher of the occult, of the hidden world, the world that's out there that you don't necessarily see every day or that is at your fingertips. But when it manifests itself, it can be rather horrifying. So that's the apocalypse there. I mean, it's a portmanteau of apocalypse culture, the Adam Parfrey book from Feral House, and of course the great James Ellroy's L.A. Confidential. So we just Jacob Everett, who's the editor in chief. I mean, the whole thing is his baby. Like, he's the mastermind behind it. So that was his effort and what he did. And we've got a special coming out soon. Like, the deadline for submissions is quite soon. It's called American Bestiary, and yesterday we just put out a Twitter post about a new book that's going to be coming out called Year of the Mountain by Max Halper. So that's going to be available for pre-order starting next month. So we've got a lot of things going on, and of course my book God is a Killer, the Alpha Edition, is available via Apocalypse Confidential, and that one is actually on Amazon. Not all of our books are, and I think going forward, probably fewer and fewer will be. Because we like to keep it. We like being boutique, honestly. Like, we like just doing whatever we want to do. There's no real effort to try to scale up or use Amazon too much for our stuff. So that's what we do as a magazine and as a publisher. And I've always been very proud to be, and consider myself very lucky to be part of Apocalypse Confidential.
Well, I don't know if okay, so first of all, thank you so much for complimenting Dustin and Tom's episodes, because those are actually two of my personal favorites that I've done in terms of like writers. I would consider Dustin like maybe one of the best living Canadian poets. He would never say that he was, but I personally think so. So yeah, it was a huge honor to do both. And actually, I have had Jacob, and we'll call her Dickie. I've had both on the show, and I actually had Brad. I had Brad Kelly on, who is the special editor for the upcoming thing. So I've kind of collected the whole set, if you want to use like a
That's right. Well, you're definitely getting closer. That's for sure.
Right. And I teased Tom. I was like, I am kind of like the farthest heaven, like adjacent podcaster. So, I said like, throw me any people want to come on. I'm very happy to have them. So, yeah, thank you so much, Max. I appreciate that. And I personally think APCON is the fucking coolest. I really do enjoy it, and I think you guys do a great job. And the aesthetic is very cool. Like I would consider my show like a cool aesthetic show. So I appreciate that greatly.
Yeah, thank you. And I would agree with that assessment, and I would also agree with your judgment of Dustin as one of the greatest Canadian poets. Although he's far too Canadian to ever say that about himself. So we'll have to do it for him.
Correct. And I'll shout him out every single time, every episode. So I totally agree with you. Why don't you talk a little bit about your book, Max? Because I think it's really interesting, the premise, and just like what are your genre influences, and what milieu would you say that you write within? And then we'll go from there.
Well, I would say that I'm a writer of noir, which is a subgenre of crime. I mean, sometimes they will still get into conversations as to whether noir is a genre on its own or it's some kind of sensibility. And although I think maybe in a way you can take other genres and make them noir, if you look at actual noir movies or noir novels, I mean, probably 99% of them are crime novels or crime films. So I would have to say that it is a subgenre of crime. And I do take that very seriously. I mean, before I wrote God as a Killer, I read a lot of crime novels because I needed to learn, what the form was. I mean, I had read a few, but not that many, and I knew that serious crime readers, I mean, would be able to tell immediately if I didn't know what I was doing. So I learned a lot doing that, and I enjoy using a lot of these genre conventions because I can just use them however I want. People are already familiar with them; they know what they are, even if it's a cliche. I'm not necessarily afraid of using it because I know I can do what I want with it and put my own stamp on it. I can improvise however I want because people are already familiar with the form that I'm using in some of these genre conventions. So I think you need some kind of balance in your writing. And some people they go too far in either direction. It's either a little too free form or it's just kind of boring by the numbers genre fiction. So I try to kind of strike a balance between the two. And I think it's just something that I naturally gravitate towards because although I mean my background is more in literary fiction, I mean a lot of it is what you would call transgressive fiction. And there's plenty of bleed over from that into noir. I mean, in a way, they both come from Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. They both come from Knut Hamsun. They come from a lot of these other authors from the second half of the 19th and first half of the 20th century. And so that's I'd say that's my kind of like my personal milieu. Obviously, with Apocalypse Confidential, we publish many different genres. I mean, there's always kind of a pulp element to it, a genre element to it usually, but that's part of what makes us distinctive, I think, as a publisher.
Like it's not that I have a film background, but it's more what I'm familiar with in terms of theory. So like genre conventions are really interesting to me because once you have conventions, you can also break them, but you have
Right,
to
that's a
do
lot
it
of fun.
right. Exactly. But you have to do it in an interesting and kind of fresh way every time if you want to break rules or bend them, which is what most people, like even really excellent writers or filmmakers do with genre. They'll bend rules rather than necessarily break them outright, because sometimes that can be a subversion of the genre convention. So I definitely think that that's APCON's whole vibe. And definitely, I think so. I'm not a noir guy, Max. I'm just going to be honest with you in the sense that, like, I'll read anything. I'm very open to that. I guess I like John Woo, like Hong Kong cinema. I would consider that sort of like maybe even a subgenre of noir. And like, if you would ask like all those Hong Kong filmmakers that were doing like heroic bloodshed films in the 80s and 90s, they would say definitely they were influenced by like American noir and French noir and sort of the crime fiction, pulp crime fiction that was available to them as kids in either comic book or film. So maybe I'm like a kind of adjacent to it, but not quite in it. So I do find it like it's kind of fresh for me.
Yeah, noir. I mean, noir is kind of twisted in a way. It has a dreamlike quality to it, I would say. But I love gangster stuff, and I mean the novel that I have coming out, sometime early next year is much more gangster than God as a Killer, which is more of kind of a rural noir. it takes place in the woods, and although it uses a lot of noir conventions, whereas the next one is the next one is a little closer to where I live in the Boston area. So it takes place in the city, in a neighborhood where I used to live, and it's an exaggeration of some of the things that I saw at various times, or kind of the history of organized crime in Boston. So that should be coming out sometime next year, and it's going to be the first part of a gangster trilogy. So that one's going to be a little more John Woo, I think, than God as a Killer, but there definitely is a connection, and I love both. Both the more heroic bloodshed type stuff and the stuff that's a little more interiorized and dreamlike, like you would get in a classic noir. But like you said, I think all those filmmakers, I mean, certainly they were influenced by Melville, by American directors as well. So I think you're correct in saying that for sure.
And I think also, like, because the history of filmmaking in East Asia is so closely entwined, like there's three primary countries where it was happening was Hong Kong, which is obviously not a country. Well, kind of it was. And then Taiwan, and then also Japan. So they were very interlinked. So I think a lot of like the Yakuza, Sonny Chiba, like 1970s, kind of like you're saying, they're kind of like Yakuza fiction. That's maybe what I'd call it, but it's kind of derivative of Chambara, like samurai films, but then they have this very American sort of like, let's look at the structure, the hierarchy of like these organizations, and like maybe focus on the anti-hero within it. And obviously Sonny Chiba made his whole career playing those characters. So I mean, I agree. I mean, I think it's like a pervading genre, and I think people like it because it has that very American quality of like individualism in the right way.
Yeah, and I mean, in the background too. I mean, there's also, I mean, I would say mid-century existentialism, and American pulp fiction was a big influence on French existentialism, because I mean, Camus was a big fan of James M. Cain, who wrote Postman Always Rings Twice, and Horace McCoy as well. And like those are both death row novels. They're death row noir novels that he read, and then he wrote Stranger, which is a death row existential crime novel. And then later on you've got, like I said, Melville, who I'm sure influenced a lot of those Asian directors. So it comes back to the same sort of situation which you're talking about, where it's the anti-hero quite often against this corrupt organization. It's the one guy who is trying to maintain some kind of morality in this world that really doesn't have much of it.
Absolutely. No, I totally agree with that. I had Parker Longbaugh on, who is also like he would say he's a crime noir writer as well. And I feel like there's like this kind of, especially like I'm a millennial, Max. I believe we're around the same age, but um I
Yeah, I'm
think
a millennial too.
okay, awesome. Okay, good. So I don't feel old. That's great. But I feel like there's maybe this underlying malaise among people in our cohort that where noir sort of rises alchemically to the surface because of um, there's a very, we'll say, I'll use a chaos magic term, a very consensus reality based ideas of what fiction should be, and what um, like heroes should be. And is there like, is the anti-hero, is he evil, quote unquote? Like, what even is that? Is he good? Is that even a thing? Is he gray? And I think that there's never been really a coherent millennial identity in fiction. And I think that perhaps that noir answers some of the broader questions.
Well, the lack of identity, I mean, I do agree with. And I mean, we're kind of seen as the generation after Gen X that kind of failed to launch, because it was mostly just like one disaster after another kind of happening to us, as we were entering adulthood. There was all the weirdness of the 2000s after 9/11, then there was the crash in 2008, and then starting in 2012, all the various culture wars and skirmishes that were being fought out every day. So yeah, it is. It's kind of grinds away at you if you pay too much attention to it, I think, as a writer, or if you allow it to affect you in that way. But as for me, I don't really care about consensus reality. It's never really interested me. I've been problematic since I was probably 4 or 5 years old, so I'm probably not going to stop anytime soon. And my fiction, I really don't give a damn what other people are doing. And if you read my stuff, I think that's pretty apparent, because I mean, there are guys like Parker out there who are also writing this kind of hard-boiled noir fiction, but there really aren't that many of us. We're just kind of doing it because we love it, and because this is our medium. This is what we chose to do, and this is what suits our abilities the best.
Well, I definitely appreciate that as a fellow troublemaker from childhood myself, or from birth, we'll say. Even though I don't always represent that like aspect of myself always on the show, just simply because I don't always have the opportunity to. But I think, yeah, I definitely understand that. We'll call it a rebel spirit against consensus reality and not really giving a. I'm gonna swear, sorry, Max. Not really giving a fuck. I don't really, but at the same time, I want to appeal to them, but not lose any of that edge.
Well, the
So,
guy who created, MADBULL34, Katsuo Koike, he was kind of known for his anti-heroes, starting with the most famous Lone Wolf and Cub. And he was a key figure in manga becoming Gekiga in, kind of like the late 60s, early 70s. And there's so many anti-heroes in his stories and in his manga, like Samurai Executioner, Lady Snowblood, Crying Freeman. And there's a couple that I found out just doing research for this podcast that sound really cool and like really off the wall, but I haven't looked into them like too much yet. And I think English translations are kind of hard to find. Like there's one called Starving Man from the early 70s that was his first collaboration with Roichi Ikegami. And it's supposed to be 1,300 pages. It takes place in the U.S. It's a revenge story, but it's just supposed to be totally off the wall. And for a while, in Japan, he was associated with the social unrest of the 70s and what people called the anarchy or the resistance. He's always been a transgressive figure in Japan, despite also being a huge golfer and publishing golf magazines and all this kind of other stuff on the side from what he's primarily known for as a writer of manga. So he's there as well. He's full of anti-heroes.
let me just say that Lone Wolf and Cub is one of my absolute favorite Chambara films. I've seen probably hundreds, if not more than that, but it's definitely one of my favorite series, probably of all time. If like somebody asked me like, what are your favorite J Cinema films, they would definitely, the three of them would be in the top 10. So, and it's a great manga as well. Like, not to, I tend to not, I am a manga reader and I have been since childhood because I'm Asian and, we have like our fobbish tendencies. But yeah, I love that whole property. And I also love Lady Snowblood. I think it's a really cool film. And so, Mad Bull, the first episode is called Hidden Rape. So, it hit me right away. I was like, okay, this is definitely like a 1980s transgressive OVA, which I'm very comfortable and used to in many ways because I also grew up on like manga and, as I said, and anime as well. But like the grittier, we'll call it the non-tourist version of anime, like Violence Jack, Legend of the Overfiend, like very transgressive, violent, and sometimes sexually explicit, but not in like a hentai way, but there's elements of it for sure. That's not like an ecchi, which is like more of a fan service or making like sexuality humorous. No, this is different than that. So I'm a big fan of it. I loved the OVA. I thought, wow, I was like, Max really hit like all the right notes with this. And he, chose a series that I felt like I could, there's a lot of meat to flush out.
Well,
No
I
pun.
only heard of it a few years ago, and actually I found out about it from Howling Mutant. He named it as one of his favorite anime on Twitter. And although, I wouldn't say I'm friends with Mutant. We have friends of friends. And, we did a podcast together on James and Kane and Postman Always Rings Twice a few years ago on Tales from the Mall. So he has really good taste when it comes to noir and crime stuff. So he said MADBULL34. And I was like, I've never heard of this. So I checked it out. And it was pretty much exactly what I wanted. This kind of super violent, like super sexual, like OVA from, the late 80s, early 90s that, definitely would have been considered cult if it had been released in the United States at that time. And yeah, I'm not the biggest fan of anime, at least in terms of watching it. I know the classics, but I saw Akira in the theater when it came out in the United States. I was probably 7 years old. I saw it. I convinced my dad to take me to go see it because my friend's older brother had seen it and he was obsessed with it. So I thought, well, my friend's older brother's really cool. I need to see this too. So I told my dad it was just a cartoon. And he took me to like the local art house theater where we lived, and I didn't sit in the same row as he did, which was pretty useful for like the like the rape scene or whatever. But my dad liked it, because he was a fan of Blade Runner. He liked Neuromancer, so it was right up his alley as well. He was probably a little surprised that I wanted him to go see it. But I mean, that story, Otomo and that story in particular have always been super important to me. Probably up there with the Iliad or Macbeth or whatever. Kind of like I got into later. Like Akira's always been a massive influence and has shaped pretty much the way I see narrative as much as any other work that I can think of. But going back to the early 90s, like I said, like something like Mad Bull wouldn't have been available. If you went to the video store, I mean, you would have been able to find Vampire Hunter D, Akira, maybe Fist of the North Star, and that was pretty much it until the mid 90s when you had Ghost in the Shell and Ninja Scroll. And those were new films that came out, I think in 95. Whereas stuff like Fist of the North Star had been made quite a while ago in Japan and was just now kind of being brought over. And I don't think there was a theatrical release for that. I think it was just on video. But yeah, I mean, obviously things are very different now. And, if you go to Barnes & Noble, the manga section is bigger than the comics section. So, a few decades later, everything is quite different.
Weeb culture is certainly mainstream. There's no question about it, especially like growing up in that sort of cultural. I mean, we lived in Hong Kong, so my dad loves electronics, and he would always like buy like whatever was cool. So it was like a mini disc or a laser disc, and so I watched Akira for the first time on Laserdisc. That's why I'm bringing it up. So it was a very seminal cinematic experience, even though I didn't watch it in a cinema proper. I also agree with like every point that you made. Like it has influenced my worldview, my views on narrative, science fiction, cyberpunk, noir, all of it, and anime and manga in general, because it's like it's a pillar that you have to like sort of be reflexive and look at all the different canon and say, okay, does this like match up to the epicness that is Akira? So I agree with all of that. And I think what I dislike about weeb culture becoming mainstream is it has in fact tamed the like what is produced. It has become a lot, people call it like anime slop or tourist slop, and I have to agree to like a large extent. I think it's changed the transgressive nature, because a lot of that stuff, like if you said, I'm not even about Mad Bulls, but even the properties that you mentioned, that wasn't necessarily cool outside of a very small, sort of like more niche, maybe like art student kind of milieu.
They might show it at midnight at your local art house theater, but these were not like advertised all that much at the time. Considered cult movies. And I think that I read an interview with Koike that he did with a guy from Dark Horse Comics, like probably 20 years ago. And they were talking about the manga industry. And I think, like you said, like manga was not necessarily considered respectable for a long time. But once the Japanese government figured out how big the industry was, it was almost big as the car industry, by the mid 2000s, that the attitude became quite more different. And they started seeing it almost as a national resource, it's like the same way as like, manufacturing would be. You're manufacturing manga and selling it to the rest of the world, or, doing the same thing with anime. So it's got a little more of like an industrial kind of vibe to it, because people know that there's a huge audience for it, all around the world.
Absolutely. And I would even say, I would go so far as to say it's a form of soft power, not necessarily negative in the way that it represents Japan and Japanese culture broadly.
Oh, absolutely. Because I mean, you might not really even know anything about Japan, but I mean, what anime is, like the average person. So yeah, I would definitely say so. But that's also the sign of, a great culture, like, the French or the English, I mean, they soft power galore, or America, so it's kind of the same thing.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And it teaches people a lot about Japan. And I think a lot of people derive most of their ideas, especially like the Zoomers and stuff. I think they derive a lot of their ideas about Japan from like anime and manga both, which is both probably negative and positive at the same time. But I definitely think like, yeah, I think most people have. So this is the thing, is that because I come from this like kind of Asian-y, fauvish background, it was always something that we did as a subculture. Like everybody who I knew, even if they were from Hong Kong or they were, you know, wherever they were from, if they were like Asian in North America, it was something that it was like a sort of cultural, cross cultural language that we all could speak for the most part. And so I've always considered it like a very pan Asian expression in a way because I think that it touches on a lot of genre that don't exist necessarily. Like there's like you brought up Lady Snowblood. Well, you can't really discuss, especially in a filmic way, you can't discuss like Chambara cinema without referencing like wuxia and the sort of Chinese literary conventions of like these anti-heroes that exist in the rivers and lakes, the Jianghu as they call it, and this whole like sort of canon of like Journey to the West and like how that was readapted for like Japan and Korea and Vietnam and all these other places. And I think that all touches on like this I don't necessarily think it's like a signification, but I definitely think that there are elements of like these older literary tropes and genres that are particularly Asian that infuse manga and anime to a great degree. And I think if you're looking especially for like 90s properties, and I'm not trying to go too weeb on you, Max, but I think that, you know, if you don't have to look that far, you can just say Dragon Ball Z or Dragon Ball Z, as I would call it. But I think that if you just look at that, you can see like that's a Journey to the West story. They've kind of remixed it. And so it holds a lot of the same properties, but it's definitely redefining what those stories and narratives mean.
Well, I'll tell you. Well, after I saw Akira, I mean, I got into the manga as well because they started publishing it in the U.S. I think it was Epic Comics, and it was beautiful. I mean, there was like full color issues, hardbound, and along with that, I was also reading a lot of wuxia comics, which were also available, like Tony Wong's Oriental Heroes, stuff like that, like Jademan comics.
I love that series. I just want to say that. I'm so glad you said that.
Yeah, and I think
Honestly,
well, they made a movie like 20 years ago, like Dragon Tiger Gate or something.
yes.
I think
It's
I
a
watched.
great movie.
Oh, really? I think I saw some of the fight scenes. I don't know if I watched the whole thing, but yeah, I was obsessed with that as well. You know, Drunken Fist, Blood Sword, Oriental Heroes. Because I mean, when I got into comics as a kid, I did like Spider-Man a lot, and I like Batman. But then I went over to Akira and Jademan comics, and then when I was finally kind of moving out of comics into literature, I got into Frank Miller, and he's kind of another formative influence on me. Even though I'm not the biggest comics reader today, I'll always love Frank Miller, and I think he played a big role in getting me into noir later on because that's why I had such a comfort level with him because I'd read Daredevil and Batman and Sin City and his other kind of noir stories. So I think that's also just kind of buried deep in my subconscious somewhere as a writer.
I mean, there's a lot worse influences than Frank Miller. He's so seminal, and he really reintroduced the kind of noir elements in back into comic books. Like, I'm not a huge comic book nerd now, but definitely, I was always more manga, Jademan comics, as you're saying. My dad used to buy them and bring them back. They were the Indonesian translations, and he'd be like, "Read this," and I'd be like, "Well, it's really hard to read that in like a totally different language." And you're like, well, here's a dictionary you can learn. So, but I really learned to appreciate them and like sort of the metaphysics because obviously this is a kind of metaphysicians podcast, at least sometimes. I really love the Chinese metaphysics, especially. I think it's very different. But to go back to Frank Miller, I would say I'm a huge Frank Miller appreciator. I'm not a Batman person and I never was, but I really love Sin City. And I think that he did reintroduce these much darker, grittier, subversive at times, transgressive always, and like anti-hero elements. I think he sort of put it back into comics because it was much more of that time when he was working. It was much more the shiny superhero, like good guy sort of archetype, and I think that he kind of broke that. So I feel like that's you could do so much worse than Frank Miller.
Oh yeah, well yeah, well like you said, I mean, when he went to New York to become a comics artist, I mean, his portfolio was all crime stuff. It wasn't superhero stuff. And when he showed it to Marvel or DC, they thought, well, you're insane. Like nobody, we're not going to publish any of this stuff. Like we're not looking for, crime comics. And then he finally got around to it, maybe 15 years later with Sin City, but by then he'd been influenced by Lone Wolf and Cub. He'd been influenced by Walter Simonson, by Moebius, by all these other, foreign influences. Not that, I mean, Simonson is American, but he was very influenced by Japanese and French comics. As his style developed. So yeah, there's a lot going on with Sin City for sure. And I think that's kind of what he wanted to do initially. And he just finally got around to it after he made a name for himself.
Well, I love that you brought up Moebius because I'm a big fan, especially of Blueberry is one of my favorites. I sort of reimagined Blueberry in my own way and like how I define who he is, but we won't get into that. The art style is incredible, but if like I've read a lot of like I speak French, Max, so I'm just gonna say it like that. But so I've read a lot of the Cahiers du Cinema interviews with him and like Jodo, and like obviously Jodo speaks English, so that's different. But like from the 70s and 80s, and he will talk about like how his influences are partly Asian and partly American. And I kind of love that because I think like, well, especially because I am Asian. So it's kind of like the syncretism right there. And you can see it in the work, although it's not necessarily explicit. And so I do love the idea of like the blending of these metaphysical systems and also genre conventions and also like narrative forms. I think that's, for me, that's very interesting. That's the most interesting because I think that's where, quote unquote, the magic is.
Well, you said your mom is Quebecois, right?
Oh, I'm surprised you knew that. Okay, yeah, she is.
Yeah,
I didn't know that
you
you knew
mentioned
that.
it in the episode with Tom. You see, I did listen to these
Okay,
episodes.
yeah. No, I know I've talked about it. I just I honestly didn't remember. Oh, I guess we did because Tom translates from French, so I must have mentioned it in context to that. So yeah, good memory, Max. I'm impressed. Thank
Well,
you so much.
well, I'm hypersensitive to all French things because, just like Tom, well, he's progressed much more quickly than I have. But for the past probably year and a few months, I've been really trying to improve my reading knowledge in French. So not even trying to be fluent necessarily, but just be able to read something and get better at translating. So I've been really enjoying that, for the last year or so.
I don't know how you feel about this, but I kind of feel like having a second or third language really helps with creative thinking, at least, if not writing itself, simply because I'm not published, so I can't speak to that sort of aspect of it. But I think it helps you synthesize and also like go beyond the normative ways of thinking about certain things. And
Well,
so
absolutely. I mean, and there are even, anything that you can do to kind of do that, I think is good. I mean, even if you just take a Word document and take it from being single space to double space, you're going to look at it a little bit differently. There are many ways of doing this, and certainly with learning a different language, you're doing that in a big way. And yeah, like I said, I mean, I've been really enjoying it. It's been a very inexpensive kind of millennial midlife crisis for me. Like studying French, but yeah, like every day, like I'll put a few words in my notebook and study them, and I've gotten much better. I mean, I did have a bit of an advantage because my sister, who's a little bit older than me, she studied it for a couple decades, and she actually lived in France for a while. So I visited her a couple times. So it wasn't like this weird thing. It was always kind of around the house, but I never really took it seriously. Like in terms of like taking a French course or something like that. So
well, full
I
disclosure, sorry, Max.
oh no, go ahead.
No. I was just gonna say I'm not super literate. Like my French is like probably like ninth, 10th grade Quebecois level. Like
Yeah.
I'm not like a university French educated person. I just studied something totally different in university, and I took different languages, and I focused more on like like East Asian and like Central Asian ideas. So I'm not gonna say that I'm like Mr. I'm not like Tom, and I'm not like you. I'm not trying to translate like poetry or anything like that. But I definitely have like the background exposure to like speaking and to reading, and I'm a terrible like writing in French is really difficult for me. So I just wanted to cop to that. I didn't want to come across like, oh, I'm so bilingual, it's like perfect. And no.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't even bothered trying to really write anything. It's just reading comprehension, so like fairly easy. But if I ever do move to France or Quebec, or Quebec's not very far from where I live. It's just as close as New York is. So that'd be a pretty good foundation for pursuing fluency if I ever want to do that.
Well, I'll just say this, Montreal has a really interesting, organized crime, perhaps still extant, history. It's very much tied to, like, the Detroit mob, to the Boston mob. There's, Italian factions, Persian factions, French, like, Hells Angels, sort of, like, the Quebecois iteration of that, and different things, like, going on. So, yeah, I think it's a cool place. I think you'd actually, enjoy some of the like history of it just simply because of your immersion into not just French but also noir.
Yeah, I've read a bit of it. I mean, like I said, it's not that far away from where I live, and I mean the Quebec biker wars in the '90s were very violent. I mean, like it was pretty insane because they weren't necessarily shooting each other; they were, stealing explosives from construction sites and like setting off all these bombs on each other, which is more of almost kind of like terroristic kind of attack on somebody. Like you don't shoot them, you blow them up. So, and that was all just being done to control the drug trade in Montreal from like the Hell's Angels and these various kind of splinter groups that kind of emerged there in the '90s. So yeah, I mean, as a crime writer, I mean, yeah, that's an extremely interesting history up there.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. And I love that you brought up the biker wars because most people aren't even peripherally aware of that history, which I think is actually really important, but also like kind of ripe for someone to, if someone's listening, or you Max, like for someone to sort of explore in a literary way.
Well, I have to confess that I mean most Americans are not terribly well informed about Canada. It's just kind of a fact. Canada.
No, that's totally fine. I'm not offended at
Yeah,
all. We're a
yeah.
second world colony. I've always said it.
Well, I mean, I don't see it that way, but I mean, Americans, I mean, we don't really care about other countries anyway. Although, I mean, that has changed a bit recently, I think, with the internet. I mean, you see that on Twitter. Like, when I was growing up in America, young people were not nearly as interested in foreign cultures as they are now. It's become more cosmopolitan in that way. Maybe it's just a result of the internet and figuring out that there is all this cool stuff out there. But a part of it's just kind of like American laziness and like we're number one, and why would you want to speak anything other than English? Kind of deal that we still kind of have. I mean, it's more kind of like a boomer thing probably at this point.
I think exposure is probably, I think you're right in that inclination to say that like exposure on the internet allows for like a greater appreciation of the permutations of like the way the world is. The only reason I don't expect Americans to care about Canada in fundamental ways, but what I do think is because we share obviously a continent that I personally think of myself as more American in the sense that like a lot of Canadians posit their identity as just being the polar opposite, like whatever they are is a negative. It's just that we are not American. Whereas I think, and I've also lived in the US, so for me, maybe I'm a bit of a traitor or not, maybe. But and the history of French in Canada has always been an antagonism to the crown and to the British, a big part of it. So if you have like that Quebecois kind of French identity, even a little bit or even half like me, you definitely appreciate like the history of like where we intersect with American history, which was like you see a lot of like people involved in the Civil War. You see a lot of people involved in like the various other wars, like the French Indian Wars, and taking the side of the Americans against the British. So I think that the relationship is a lot closer, but maybe that's just my, perspectival relationship with it. But I think we should maybe move into Mad Bull like more
Sure.
substantively. And yeah, we won't go on about Quebec and all that. But I appreciate that you brought it up. But yeah, let's talk about Mad Bull and sort of like I'll like give a outline of what it is and who the characters are and what the contours of it are.
Well, MADBULL34, it was a seinen manga that was published, I think, between '85 and '91, so the second half of the '80s. And then there's a 4-part OVA came out in the early '90s, just as the manga was ending. I think it was '90 to '92. So it's just as someone who has a background in studying and reading Elizabethan revenge plays, Jacobean revenge plays, I like the mixed mode. I like mixing extreme violence with humor, maybe throw some sex in there, and you get all three of those with MADBULL34. It's almost like an affectionate parody. I mean, given how over the top it is, it's obviously not like a straightforward take on American cop shows. It's way over the top. It's almost like an affectionate parody of a show like Hill Street Blues from the '80s, like a tough like New York cop show, with some added stuff from the crime cinema, the American crime cinema of the '70s, like Dirty Harry, like the cop who plays by his own rules, Death Wish, French Connection, and the titular Mad Bull is this guy called Sleepy John Estes, and he's like 8 feet tall. I think he's Afro-Puerto Rican, I think is the ethnicity that they give him. But he has a lot of enemies in his precinct, the 34th precinct, because he actually runs the vice there himself. He's the pimp of precinct 34, but he's a good guy, so he makes sure that all the girls are treated right. And he actually, like a pimp, he will take their earnings. And although, they get sort of mad at him when he does it, they know that he's doing it. So, he kind of puts it together in this pool so these girls can pay off their medical bills, or they'll have money to go to a shelter if they need it, or, whatever they kind of need in their line of work. He has like a bunch of money there for them. So he has no qualms whatsoever about like blowing dudes' heads off, like criminals. I think in the first 5 minutes of the first episode, I think he blows 2 guys' heads off, like within the first 5 minutes. So it gives you, a taste of what you're going to get. So it's like very, exaggerated super violence. So Mad Bull, Sleepy John Estes, is paired up with a rookie. He's a Japanese American named Daizaburo Ediban, although I don't think they ever actually call him Eddie in the OVA. They just call him Daizaburo. So, at first, he is a very by-the-book cop, and he's kind of shocked by, they call him Sleepy rather than Mad Bull, for most of the anime. So he's not too sure about Sleepy's methods, but sooner or later he kind of realizes that this is the only way that the 34th precinct can be run. And he has his friends back quite a bit. At the end of the first episode, Sleepy is brought forth towards this kind of police tribunal, where they have all these photos of him, kind of blowing away all these criminals in a very gruesome manner. But every time they put a slide on the screen, Daizaburo is there, kind of explaining the context and telling that, well, Sleepy had to do it. He was saving this girl's life by, separating this guy's head from his shoulders with a shotgun. And they introduce a few more characters. I think the second episode, Perrine is introduced. So she's a bit higher. I think she's a detective. So she's a bit higher up than Daizaburo and Sleepy, who are just beat cops, who are out there on the street. And there's a couple of, crime reporters who are kind of in this pool of characters, plenty of gangsters for sure. Even this kind of like triad gang of assassins, kind of Year of the Dragon style or China Girl style from the, like kind of like the mid 80s when, Chinese gangs were getting some headlines in America around New York. So, and I think, and then the last episode, there's even it gets a bit sci-fi with the Capricorn murders, and this cop killer seems to look like a cross between Predator and the Xenomorph from Alien. So it even goes a bit into sci-fi. Like there aren't too many limits with the series, and that's one of the things that I like so much about it.
I love Sleepy, whatever, Mad Bull. Yeah, Afro Puerto Rican. It's a very interesting trope that you see a lot in anime when they'll make a kind of I'm not making a racialist argument or anything, but I do, you can see it. Like it's in Bleach, it's in various other series. They'll make a character half some kind of like Latin or African American, and that character will then possess like greater physical potentiality or also like a kind of amorality. Not necessarily that they're amoral as a character, but it kind of there's an implication that they have a different kind of like more law of the jungle, I guess, sort of idea of the world and how they sort of navigate it. And I like that they have like I love that he sets it in America. I think that's a really interesting trope, and I agree. Definitely drawing from Charlton Heston and like Death Wish. That's immediately what I thought of. I guess the first episode is very transgressive. They're doing a sting operation in this park for rapists, and they're dressed. They're dressed like drag queens, kind of, and well, not kind of. They are, and they are sort of watching this very beautiful woman be attacked by thugs, and yes, he does blow their heads off. And interestingly enough, she's much more offended by the death than being assaulted. So I don't know, that it sort of reflects there's a reflexive element to modern discourse, gender discourse, we'll say. But I also think that the mentioning the suit in the fourth episode, I wrote down Guyver because I'm very familiar with like those kind of dark sci-fi anime and OVA series. But yeah, there's definitely, it's a sci-fi for sure. He has a plasma rifle where everyone is using shotguns and like the 45s, I guess. And yeah, it kind of comes out of nowhere. That's a really interesting element of it, that he was able to weave in this different genre into the narrative that is really about a pimp who runs a precinct.
Yeah, I mean, coming from a crime background, I was trying to think of maybe some crime anime, and I mean, there are. I mean, I'm sure there's a bunch that I probably don't know of, but this one came to my mind immediately. Um, and I mean, I read a few reviews of it that have been posted at various times. I think one in the last couple of decades, probably, that are still online, and like most of them are bad. Like they didn't like it at all. I mean, even to the point of being offended. But I mean, some of them also said, well, they were like, well, it's so bad, it's good. But I don't really see that at all, because I'm not expecting some kind of documentary style show about police work. You know what I mean? Like it's obviously not what this is. You
It's
know,
not a procedural, for
right?
sure.
Yeah, it's kind of loosely based again on these shows like Hill Street Blues that were very popular at the time. But Koike is obviously going somewhere very different, and he's doing kind of what he does. And I think that with him, I mean, people know his period stuff quite well. Everybody knows Lone Wolf and Cub. People know Lady Snowblood, but a lot of his stuff is just kind of more contemporary, just kind of like pulpy stuff. With lots of sex and violence and humor, and it moves very quickly. And of course, something like Lone Wolf and Cub does as well, but it just can't help but come across as a little more respectable and stately, because it's a period, story about about samurai and ronin. It's not about these like cops in 80s New York just blowing away a bunch of scumbags and having lots of sex with the prostitutes there and stuff like that. So
That's a great point, and I apologize because I forgot to say this when I was mentioning how I love the setting in New York. But I think that he actually does that. Obviously, it's intentional, but I think he does it to sort of transcend the limits of like a closed Japanese society. That's sort of how I interpret it, like making it a diaspora story in a way, because American society is a lot more for compared to Japan, I think is a lot wilder in some ways, or at least in its cinematic universe is a lot wilder. So he sort of sets it there so it can explore these like outer limits of of the violence, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, basically.
well, one of the characters that I didn't mention, was probably my favorite, was Nickel the mechanic. So he's a I mean, they have all, and some of these characters, I mean, like they have these like very interesting backstories. And he's a because Nickel he looks like Jack Nicholson, which is why he's called Nickel. And he's called Nickel the mechanic. He's a diabetic assassin who is always drinking cans of coffee, and he's always peeing everywhere. So he's like pissing down the street, and his piss smells like sugar. So Sleepy can always identify where he is or if he's around, because he smells this like sugary piss. And in the manga, he has a chance to actually kill Nickel when Nickel tries to assassinate him. And Daizaburo says, well, this guy tried to kill you. You're just going to let him go? Like, what are you doing? And Sleepy says, well, he's so easy to smell that if I let him go, he's just going to lead me back to the mob boss who hired him. And that's who I really want. I don't really care about Nickel. But that's just kind of like, yeah, again, like a very kind of like wild character that, I mean, even in American anime like film, like you wouldn't really get someone like that. It's like so crazy. This guy Nickel the mechanic.
What I think is interesting is the canned coffee element of him is very Japanese.
Yeah, I thought so too. I mean, I think probably an American would notice that right away watching this, because I mean, some people drink canned coffee now, but it's not really the same thing.
No, absolutely not. That's like you go to H Mart and get, Kona or whatever, Sapporo Black Boss. That's what I like. But yeah, there's so many options. But yeah, that's definitely a very Asian thing. It's not a Japanese thing in particular, but it's not a common American trope for sure. And I think that the sort of like the diabetes sweet smell of his urine is also interesting. And I think it's also like there's a lot of fetish elements in the film. I'm not trying to like go in a weird tangent here, Max, but I think it's I think it w- I think responsibly I have to say that there are, anime has always been sexually transgressive. There's always been that element, especially in this period. And so I like that the character is like so crazy. Like it works for what the series is. For
Well, it's a
me,
pretty weird series, so I mean, obviously there is a bunch of like fetishistic stuff in it. I mean, there aren't a whole lot of limits with the series.
that's what I think is
Yeah.
interesting, especially even in the first episode where he murders the sort of would-be rapist, is that it's even that is very there's a sexually explicit element with the way the blood sort of splashes on the girl. So, yeah, it's definitely like embracing that kind of gore, sort of like fetish elements. And yeah, a lot of the whole film is about that, I would say. And like even the way that the sort of peripheral characters, the cops, like when they get into gunfights or when they get murdered themselves, I think that there is like it's definitely like it's voyeuristic. It's looking at the death and destruction, and but it does it in a tongue-in-cheek way, obviously, as well. So that's also very anime. It sort of breaks the fourth wall in a way because it's kind of like, well, these characters don't really matter.
Yeah, and I mean, like I said, I like the mixed mode. I mean, obviously, if you go back to the classics, you have tragedy or you have comedy, but you don't necessarily like the Greek classics, like you don't necessarily have to do that. You can put violence with comedy, you put tragedy with some sex. You can I mean the Greeks did that as well, but you can kind of mix it up. And I think that some people, I mean, they still have a little trouble, and they want to untangle those things and separate them. But it can be very effective. I mean, depending on who's doing it and how skilled they are, because sometimes you're laughing and you don't quite know why. It's an uneasy laughter, and I find that I'm drawn to those stories quite a bit.
Absolutely, as you referenced in the beginning, there's an element of cinema of the transgressive in this for sure. Like where you have to kind of be you have to be a perceptive witness to like the filmic universe and like understand that yeah, it's syncretic. It's bringing the multiple genres together. It's bringing multiple like dramatic elements. Sorry, I couldn't think of it. Bringing multiple dramatic elements together. And also I also find that the humor in the series, it helps propel the narrative. Like it keeps the flow working. Like you never get too caught up in the loss of a character, the loss of peripheral characters, or in any violent episodes, because obviously someone comes in and breaks it. And this is also true of like the sexuality elements of it, is that is that there's always a humorous element, whether that's like Sleepy with like a prostitute or they're rescuing someone or whatever it is. It's always like it's not it doesn't take itself seriously. I think that's what I'm trying to say. It's kind of like looking
Yeah,
to the
definitely.
audience to like, yeah, recognize that this is a way to just like move forward. And maybe that's also part of like Sleepy's pathology, is like it doesn't really matter. Like the externalities, he's conscientious, but he doesn't get stuck on things. He's very like forward moving.
He is, and I think part of that is also just Koike's approach in general, because reading more about him and his methods. I mean, I posted an excerpt from an interview that he gave to Dark Horse, like I said, 20 years ago on Twitter. I think, maybe last week or something. He's talking about his methods of character creation. And, he set up this school called the Gekichika Sonjuku back in the 70s. And I mean, if you look at the students that he had, it's like a who's who, of who got involved in manga and even video games. Like the guy who created Dragon Quest was a student of his. So for Koike, it all starts with the character. And once you have a strong central character, things around him can shift. Like you can almost do whatever you want because it's going to be unified by the strength of that central character. Everything's going to be filtered through him or her. So I think that that's something that he carried over into something that's kind of over the top is MADBULL34 as well. And I mean, there is Daizaburo. He's kind of the sidekick, but again, it's not, the series is not named after him. It's all being done through the vision of the Mad Bull.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up because it is kind of it's his path, it's Daisaburo's path. It's kind of unfolding before him, sort of a hermeneutic. Like he gets brought through this kind of seedy underground world, this world of, they're not even anti-heroes really, they're just straight up like bad guys.
Yeah.
And he kind of has to learn on the ground as a beat cop, which is also an interesting positionality, like who he is and sort of his moral. It's not even that it's so interior, it's not, but I do think it's interesting because it is what you're saying. It's not really about him, but at the same time, he is like a vehicle for this narrative to take place.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we can relate more to him than we can to Mad Bull. And it's Daizaburo who changes during the course of the series. Sleepy doesn't change that much. He stays pretty much the same. Whereas Daizaburo figures out that, you can't just be this by the book cop and somehow keep the 34th precinct safe from all these like increasingly like insane criminals that are trying to do who knows what or take over Sleepy's territory. So yeah, he is a very interesting figure. And I mean, you could do a second series maybe with him called Daizaburo, but this one was going to have to be called Mad Bull and have Sleepy kind of be the central character that everything was organized around. Because I think that with Daizaburo, he's a little too mutable. He's changing too much, which is kind of interesting because usually, I mean, I think at least in kind of Western fiction or storytelling, you think of, the Bildungsroman, you think of the main character as being the one who changes. Whereas in this one, it's not. It's the sidekick who changes, and it's the main character who stays the same.
From a metaphysical perspective, that's actually very like what you're saying, but also because I watched it, I also found the same thing. He is kind of the hermetic character, not necessarily for any other reason than he is mutable and also flexible. He changes. He is kind of the I don't really like this Joseph Campbell language, but he is kind of like the hero's journey in a way, is that he starts off as like the spark and then he becomes quote unquote a man by that, at least more so. Like you're saying, he kind of realizes like, okay, I actually have to incorporate these elements that are perhaps socially and morally and even legally black or gray. He has to incorporate that into himself. And so that's a very interesting, if you want to look at it from a more metaphysical perspective, that is quite interesting. Simply because that is kind of the standard journey that I often discuss. Again, I don't usually use, I would use Kabbalah or Tantra to sort of explain these ideas, but it is a hermeneutic of the magician rather than the hero, the normative hero.
Right, and not that he is lacking in heroic qualities, but it's a very different kind of heroism from what you get with Sleepy, because I mean, although Daizaburo, I mean, he is pretty good with his feet and his fists, and he can fire a gun pretty well. I think one of the bravest things he does is when he gets like the absolute shit beaten out of him in the second episode, when Don Enrico's crew has Perrine down and they're about to rape her, and he offers himself up instead, and they waste their time beating him up until Sleepy appears, and then throws a bunch of explosives through the window. But yeah, he's always grateful for Sleepy, because Sleepy is this big, imposing, totally fearless, like huge, like physically commanding guy who can actually go toe to toe with some of these criminals, whereas Daizaburo obviously cannot. His role, whatever it's going to be, is going to be very different from Sleepy's role.
Yeah, there's a more intellectual, a sort of intellectual element to him, whereas Sleepy is absolutely the tank, if you want to use like a very vulgar RPG sort of comparison, for sure. You could say he's almost the mage of the party, not because he's not a decent fighter and a good, as you said, like a gunsmith or whatever. He is able to, yeah, he represents a totally different character class for sure. And so even the way he approaches, I think the story is supposed to be, they're almost antagonistic in a way, and I think that's maybe more of a, if the American was writing the series, I feel like they would be more at odds, but I feel like because it's a Japanese fellow writing the series, I feel like it's more in line with the Japanese cultural custom to like follow your senpai or follow your senior. And so Mad Bull sort of leads him through the hermeneutic because he's already gone through it himself. So he kind of serves as like the quote unquote guru or the older brother or the father figure, paternal figure that allows him to sort of walk through the gateways of knowledge and perception.
Absolutely. I think we've covered it pretty well. I mean, it's just a 4-part, OVA
Yeah,
in
it's short.
the 90s. Yeah, but it's so much fun to watch. I certainly had a lot of fun rewatching it, gearing up for this podcast, and also just learning a bit more about Katsuo Koike as well, because I didn't really know his pedigree. To be honest, I didn't even know it was the same guy who had done Lone Wolf and Cub. Because I had the first volume that Dark Horse put out, a while ago on my bookshelf, and I'd read it. But I didn't know that Koike had written MADBULL34 as well. So I was like, what? That's interesting. So I'm looking forward to digging into some of more of his stuff that's less known over here that he did in the 70s. I think even if I can't read and understand it, I at least want to kind of take a look at the storytelling, because I'm a big Ikegami fan, as an appreciator of fine manga artists. So it's been a really great experience just doing this, and I'm glad that we had a place to do it.
Absolutely. Well, let me say, if you ever want to come back and do any other, whatever other manga series, OVA, anime, or anything, I'm very happy to host you, Max. And I had a lot of fun. I think this was a great series. I highly recommend it, regardless of what, the online sort of like anime police say about it. I really liked it. I would give it like an 8 out of 10. I think that if you're a true anime fan and not a tourist, I think you'll like this. I think if you're a noir fan, you'll love this. And I think that if you like Chambara, this is a good extension of it. But as Max said, it's not quite as respectable as a Lone Wolf and Cub, but it's similar. It has a similarity. There's a parallel current. So yeah, I would highly recommend it. But I just want to say, like, Max, you're invited on the show anytime. You just tell me what you want to do, and I'll watch it or read it or whatever. And yeah, come back and we'll discuss it.
Well, thank you, and I'll be looking forward to Jacob and Dickie's episodes when those are up.
I think that'll be really awesome to rep the APCON crew. I really appreciate that you guys were cool enough, like all of you wanted to come on, like very excited. And I want you to plug your Twitter, and I'll obviously include all your links, including your book, in the show notes, as I always do. And say whatever projects you want to plug and where people can find you.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm Max Thrax. My Twitter page, you can find it at Thrax Maximilian. And be sure to check out Apocalypse Confidential. Our website is apocalypse-confidential.com. As we mentioned before, American Bestiary is our next literary special. Submissions for that are closing quite soon. So that'll be already over by the time this comes out. But we've got that coming up, and we're super excited for the summer. And, keep an eye on Apocalypse Confidential as well.